The frozen ruins of Stalingrad echoed with the sharp chatter of a weapon the Germans had once mocked. When they first saw the Soviet PPSh-41, they laughed, calling it crude, heavy, and wasteful, a peasant's gun, unworth. The PPSh-41 was born out of desperation. Forged in the crucible of a war, the Soviets were never supposed to survive. In 1940, as Nazi Germany prepared to unleash Operation Barbarossa, the Red Army faced a crisis. Their existing submachine gun, the PPD-40, was expensive, complex, and far too low to produce in the numbers needed for a nation fighting for its life. Enter Georgy Shpagin, a weapons designer who understood exactly what the Soviet Union needed. Not elegance, not perfection, but a gun so cheap and simple that it could be stamped out in factories, village workshops, or even in the ruins of bombed cities. The result was the PPSh-41. Built from stamped steel with a simple blowback mechanism, it was the opposite of German craftsmanship, where the Wehrmacht prized precision machining and polished weapons like the Mauser rifle or MP-40. The Soviets embraced brutal simplicity. The PPSh-41 didn't need to be beautiful, it just needed to work. It could be made in a fraction of the time, with less skilled labor, and in numbers that dwarfed German production. The first time German soldiers laid eyes on it, they laughed. To them, it looked like junk metal bolted together by peasants. Its oversized drum magazine, holding an absurd 71 rounds, looked wasteful, impractical, and ridiculous compared to the neat stick magazines of their MP-40. To the German mind, this weapon was proof of Soviet inferiority. Crude, heavy, and a symbol of industrial backwardness. But what they didn't realize was that the PPSh-41 was designed with a very different philosophy. It wasn't meant for single, disciplined shots. It was meant to drown the battlefield in fire, to overwhelm German squads with sheer volume. The Soviets weren't trying to match German marksmanship. They were rewriting the rules of close combat. By 1941, the Soviet factories were pouring them out in staggering numbers. And soon, in the snow-covered fields and shattered cities of the Eastern Front, German soldiers would stop laughing, because the crude peasant gun was about to prove it could shred entire ranks with industrial fury. In the summer of 1941, as German tanks rolled across the Soviet Union and the Wehrmacht advanced hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks, confidence was sky-high. German soldiers prided themselves on precision weapons. The bolt-action Mauser Kar 98K, the sleek MP-40 submachine gun, the MG-34 machine gun. To them, these were the hallmarks of a professional army. Discipline, training, and engineering superiority would crush the Red Army. And when they first encountered captured PPSh-41s, their reaction was almost unanimous. Laughter. The PPSh-41 didn't fit the German ideal of a weapon. It was heavy at over 10 pounds with a full drum. The oversized magazine rattled when carried, and its crude finish looked nothing like the polished blued steel of German arms. Intelligence reports dismissed it as inefficient and wasteful. A gun like this, they argued, could never win battles. It consumed ammunition at an alarming rate, over 900 rounds per minute. Its bulky 71-round drum made logistics a nightmare. And in the eyes of German officers, it symbolized everything wrong with Soviet industry: mass production over precision, quantity over quality. The mocking wasn't just on the battlefield. German propaganda leaflets painted Soviet soldiers as poorly equipped peasants, armed with clumsy bullet hoses that lacked the sophistication of German arms. Officers reassured their men that the PPSh-41 was dangerous only to the Soviets themselves, likely to jam, misfire, or run out of ammunition before it did real damage. But the truth was more complex. The PPSh-41's simplicity made it nearly indestructible in the harsh Russian winters, while German Mausers froze and MP-40 jams jammed in sub-zero weather. The PPSh-41 kept firing. Its rate of fire, once dismissed as wasteful, became terrifying in close combat. Entire squads could unleash overlapping bursts, flooding trenches, alleys, and buildings with a storm of lead. The Wehrmacht's arrogance blinded them. They believed discipline and superior engineering would always triumph. But war on the Eastern Front was not fought on neat parade grounds. It was fought in forests, in villages, in frozen cities where soldiers were often just yards apart. In that brutal environment, the PPSh-41 would soon reveal that what the Germans mocked as a crude peasant gun was, in fact, one of the deadliest tools of the war. The first time German troops faced the PPSh-41 in real combat, the laughter stopped instantly. It happened not in grand tank battles or sweeping offensives, but in the tight, brutal clashes that came as the Wehrmacht pushed deeper into Soviet territory. In the forests of Belarus, in the villages of Ukraine, and later in the hell of Stalingrad, small Soviet squads armed with the so-called peasant gun ambushed German patrols and showed them what 71 rounds of raw firepower really meant. The PPSh-41 fired the 7.62 by 25mm Tokarev cartridge, a small but blisteringly fast round. At close range, it punched straight through German helmets, light cover, and even vehicle doors. Soldiers who were used to the measured crack of rifles suddenly found themselves under a storm of bullets so dense it felt inescapable. One Wehrmacht report described a single Soviet fighter opening fire with his PPSh-41 and forcing an entire platoon to dive for cover. What had been mocked as wasteful turned out to be overwhelming. Veterans recalled the psychological shock. German training emphasized timing enemy reloads, counting shots from a rifle or machine gun to know when to charge. But against a weapon with a 71-round drum, that tactic collapsed. The bursts never seemed to end. By the time a German soldier thought the gun might be empty, more rounds came pouring out. Soviet soldiers didn't fight like their German counterparts. They weren't aiming for careful, precise shots. They used the PPSh-41 like a fire hose. "We didn't aim," one Red Army veteran later said. "We poured bullets until nothing moved." In ambushes, they would open up with multiple PPSh-41s at once, blanketing an area with lead so thick that survivors often described it as drowning in bullets. For the Germans, the experience was disorienting and terrifying. The Mauser Kar 98K, their trusted rifle, was nearly useless in close quarters, where reloading each bolt-action round felt like an eternity. The MP-40, while reliable, had a much slower rate of fire and only a 32-round magazine. Against a weapon that could spit nearly 1,000 rounds per minute from a drum holding more than double the ammunition, German troops suddenly found themselves outgunned in the very situations they thought they would dominate. The mockery turned to fear. What they had once dismissed as crude Soviet mass production now looked like something far worse. A weapon designed specifically to shred them apart in the brutal reality of the Eastern Front. If the forests and villages of Eastern Europe showed the PPSh-41's potential, the ruins of Stalingrad revealed its true purpose. Nowhere on the Eastern Front was the gun more feared than in that shattered city on the Volga. For months in late 1942, German troops pushed through streets reduced to rubble, factories turned to fortresses, and stairwells where life and death were decided at distances of a few meters. In this environment, the PPSh-41 became the ultimate weapon. The Soviets knew the city better than their enemy, and they armed their fighters accordingly. Whole platoons of Red Army soldiers stormed German positions carrying nothing but PPSh-41s and sacks of drum magazines. In the twisted corridors of the tractor factory or in the basements of apartment blocks, a single soldier with a fully loaded PPSh-41 could unleash a torrent of fire that cleared rooms in seconds. Unlike the Mauser rifle or even the MG-34, the Soviet submachine gun was built for this kind of war: fast, brutal, and close. German veterans recalled the fear that crept into their minds every time they entered a ruined building. The sharp, buzzing chatter of a PPSh-41 echoing down a hallway meant death could be just around the corner. The weapon's 71-round drum didn't just fire bullets, it created storms of steel that made cover useless. In stairwell fights, Germans would toss grenades upward, only to be answered with a rolling wall of fire from above. In sewers, where battles were fought in pitch darkness, the PPSh-41 turned tight tunnels into killing grounds. The Germans tried to adapt. They used flamethrowers, explosives, and close-quarters MG teams to counter the Soviets. But nothing erased the psychological impact of the PPSh-41. Survivors described the sound as a never-ending thunder that filled the ruins and broke morale. Some units reported entire sections of street blockades being held off by just a handful of Soviet submachine gunners. Stalingrad proved something German intelligence had refused to admit. The PPSh-41 wasn't just a crude Soviet copy of Western ideas. It was uniquely suited to the kind of combat the Eastern Front demanded. And in the city that would mark the turning point of the war, it wasn't just Soviet tanks or artillery that broke the German advance. It was squads of soldiers with a weapon the Germans had once mocked. In Stalingrad, the PPSh-41 became more than a gun. It became a symbol of Soviet defiance, a mechanical roar that declared the city would not fall. By 1943, the Soviets had learned to turn the PPSh-41 from just a weapon into a strategy. Where the Germans saw an ammunition-hungry bullet hose, the Red Army saw a tool for mass fire superiority. Instead of sprinkling a few submachine gunners among riflemen, Soviet commanders began arming entire companies, sometimes even whole battalions, with PPSh-41s. The effect on the battlefield was staggering. In forests, Soviet troops would wait silently for German patrols to enter killing zones. Then, at the signal, dozens of PPSh-41s erupted at once. 71 rounds per drum, multiplied across dozens of gunners, created a hurricane of lead that no squad could withstand. German tactics that relied on measured rifle fire and carefully timed counterattacks collapsed under the sheer volume of bullets. A survivor from the Wehrmacht later recalled, "It felt like the air itself turned to metal." The psychological effect was as devastating as the physical one. German training taught soldiers to exploit reload windows. A Mauser rifle carried 5 rounds, the MP-40 just 32. Soldiers were drilled to count shots, to know when an enemy weapon would fall silent. Against the PPSh-41, that training was useless. With 71 rounds in a drum and a rate of fire approaching 1,000 rounds per minute, the bursts seemed endless. By the time German soldiers thought a Soviet gunner must be empty, more bullets were already slamming into their positions. The Soviets also developed brutal new tactics for assaults. Instead of advancing in thin lines, PPSh-41 gunners rushed forward in swarms, pouring continuous fire as they closed the distance. Even if dozens fell, those who reached German trenches arrived with drums still half full, ready to clear entire positions in seconds. For German troops armed with bolt-action rifles, facing such an assault was like standing in front of a tidal wave. At Stalingrad, Kursk, and countless unnamed villages, this doctrine reshaped the battlefield. German officers who once mocked the PPSh-41 now wrote in grim reports that their men felt outgunned and overwhelmed. Some units began retreating at the first sound of its chatter. The Soviets had taken a weapon the Germans called wasteful and turned it into an engine of mass destruction. The PPSh-41 wasn't about precision or elegance. It was about drowning the enemy in fire until there was nothing left to resist. And on the Eastern Front, where every fight was brutal and close, That doctrine proved devastating. What made the PPSh-41 truly terrifying was not just its firepower, it was its numbers. By the end of the war, over 6 million of these weapons had rolled out of Soviet factories, making it one of the most produced submachine guns in history. While the Germans were struggling to maintain output on precision-engineered rifles and machine guns, the Soviets flooded the battlefield with the PPSh-41. It was cheap, fast to produce, and so simple that even factories bombed to rubble could be relocated and set up to make more within weeks. Unlike the finely crafted Mauser or MP-40, the PPSh-41 didn't need master machinists. A worker with minimal training could stamp out the parts, weld them together, and have a gun ready for the front, in a fraction of the time it took German industry to complete one rifle. For the Soviets, who were fighting a war of attrition where every hour counted, this was revolutionary. Soldiers often said it felt like the PPSh-41 was born as fast as we died. The weapon's spread went far beyond regular Red Army units. Soviet partisans operating behind German lines adopted it as their weapon of choice. In forests, swamps, and villages across occupied Eastern Europe, partisans used PPSh-41 ambushes to annihilate convoys and garrisons. Its rugged design meant it could keep firing even when neglected for days, buried in mud, or dragged through snow. German soldiers who once laughed at its crude appearance learned to dread its sudden chatter in the night. For many Soviet fighters, the PPSh-41 wasn't just a gun, it was a lifeline. Survivors recalled entire squads being issued nothing but the submachine gun, with every man carrying drums of ammunition strapped across their chest. In an assault, the effect was overwhelming. German units were often wiped out in minutes, stunned not by precision, but by sheer volume of fire. The irony was bitter. The very features German officers had mocked, the oversized drum, the crude finish, the wasteful rate of fire, were exactly what made the PPSh-41 perfect for the savage, close-quarters war on the Eastern Front. It was never designed for elegance. It was designed for one purpose: to overwhelm, to terrify, and to kill in massive numbers. By 1943, German reports admitted what their propaganda would not. The PPSh-41 had become the dominant weapon of the Soviet infantry. It was no longer just a symbol of Soviet resilience. It was proof that quantity, when paired with ruthless tactics, could rewrite the rules of modern combat. By 1942, the mockery had stopped, replaced by something far stranger: envy. German soldiers who had once ridiculed the PPSh-41 now grabbed every chance to carry one into battle. The reason was simple. In the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front, the PPSh-41 outperformed many German weapons. It didn't jam in the freezing cold. It spat out nearly 1,000 rounds per minute, and its 71-round drum let a soldier hold off entire squads before reloading. Soon, German units were reporting widespread use of captured Soviet guns. The Wehrmacht didn't just tolerate this, they made it official. Captured PPSh-41s were redesignated as the MP-41R and even issued formally to frontline troops. German engineers went a step further, converting some to fire 9mm parabellum rounds so they could use standard German ammunition. Factories in occupied territories were ordered to make the modifications, producing thousands of Germanized Soviet submachine guns. It was the ultimate humiliation. The Reich that prided itself on engineering superiority was now arming its soldiers with the very weapon it had mocked as Russian junk. Frontline reports showed why. Soldiers praised the PPSh-41's rugged reliability and overwhelming firepower. One German veteran recalled, "When you had a Russian gun, you felt safe. It always fired, no matter how cold, no matter the mud. Compared to the MP-40, with its smaller 32-round magazine and slower rate of fire, the Soviet design felt like raw, unstoppable power in a soldier's hands. The irony was bitter. The Wehrmacht had once dismissed the PPSh-41 as proof of Soviet inferiority. Now, their own men preferred it to the weapons of German design. Some commanders even had to restrict captured use policies to prevent shortages of 7.62 by 25 mm Tokarev ammunition because too many troops were abandoning their MP-40s for the Soviet gun. It was a reversal that struck at the very heart of German pride. What they once ridiculed as crude mass production now symbolized an uncomfortable truth. The Soviets had built a weapon perfectly adapted for the war they were fighting, while Germany's supposed superiority was proving less effective in the frozen close-quarters hell of the Eastern Front. By 1943 and 1944, the PPSh-41 was no longer just a weapon. It had become a sound etched into the nightmares of German soldiers. Veterans described the noise as a constant, metallic buzz that echoed through forests, trenches, and ruined cities. To many Wehrmacht troops, hearing that chatter in the dark was enough to trigger panic. It meant the Red Army was near, and with it came storms of fire no rifle line could withstand. The weapon was particularly terrifying at night. Soviet shock troops often staged sudden assaults under cover of darkness, opening with massed bursts of PPSh-41 fire. German survivors remembered the confusion. Muzzle flashes lighting ruined buildings, the endless roar of automatic fire, and comrades falling before they even knew what was happening. It was like the earth itself was spitting bullets at us, one veteran later recalled. The psychological edge was not accidental. Soviet commanders learned to lean on the PPSh-41's intimidating effect, sometimes unleashing waves of gunfire before a charge just to break German morale. Even when casualties were high, the overwhelming firepower convinced many German defenders that they were outnumbered by far more than reality. As the Soviets shifted to the offensive after Stalingrad, the PPSh-41 became the voice of their advance. In forests, German patrols dreaded ambushes, where entire partisan bands opened fire with the submachine gun. In cities like Kharkov and later Warsaw, the close-range dominance of the weapon turned street fighting into slaughterhouses for defenders. Even in fortified bunkers, German troops found themselves pinned by concentrated PPSh-41 bursts pouring through firing slits and doorways. The fear spread beyond the front lines. German intelligence reports noted a growing defeatism among troops, tied directly to encounters with the Soviet weapon. Some reports bluntly admitted that Soviet infantry, once considered inferior, were now overwhelming German units by arming entire companies with PPSh-41s. It wasn't just the weapon itself, it was what it represented: the industrial might of the Soviet Union, producing millions of simple, deadly guns faster than Germany could destroy them. For the Red Army, the PPSh-41 had become more than a gun. It was a psychological weapon, a roar of defiance that echoed through every ruined street and forest clearing. And for the Germans, who had once sneered at its crude design, it was now a chilling reminder that the war on the Eastern Front was no longer theirs to win. By the time the Red Army stormed Berlin in 1945, the PPSh-41 was everywhere. Millions of Soviet soldiers carried it across the ruins of Europe, and its distinct chatter echoed in the final battles of the Reich. German soldiers who had once mocked it as a peasant gun now recognized it as one of the defining weapons of the war, an instrument that had shredded their ranks, broken their morale, and helped turn the tide of the Eastern Front. Its legacy was staggering. Over 6 million PPSh-41s had been produced, making it one of the most widely manufactured submachine guns in history. It was not just a weapon of the Red Army. It was the weapon of Soviet partisans, resistance fighters, and liberation armies across Eastern Europe. Wherever the Nazis advanced, the PPSh-41 rose as the gun of defiance. What made it so enduring was its design philosophy. Unlike German weapons that demanded precision machining, the PPSh-41 embodied Soviet pragmatism, simple, rugged, and brutally effective. It worked in mud, in snow, in the rubble of Stalingrad, and the forests of Belarus. It didn't matter if it was dragged through swamps or dropped in ice, the gun would still fire. Its 71-round drum, once laughed at as wasteful, became its defining symbol, a rolling thunder of bullets that could hold off entire platoons. The irony of its journey was profound. German soldiers who once ridiculed it ended up capturing and converting it for their own use. After the war, it continued to shape history. The design philosophy of the PPSh-41, simplicity, mass production, and overwhelming firepower, inspired future weapons, most famously the AK-47. In a sense, the PPSh-41 was the bridge between the old world of bolt-action rifles and the modern age of assault rifles. For the Soviets, the PPSh-41 became a symbol of resilience. It was a weapon that reflected their reality. Not elegant, not polished, but unbreakable, relentless, and produced in such massive numbers that no enemy could ignore it. For German veterans, it was remembered with a mix of dread and respect, the sound that haunted their memories long after the war ended. The laughter that had greeted its first appearance in 1941 had turned to silence by 1945. Silence broken only by the mechanical roar of a weapon that proved one of the most mocked designs in history could also be one of the most decisive. The PPSh-41 had been underestimated, ridiculed, and dismissed. But in the end, it was the gun that helped break the back of the Wehrmacht, and history would never forget it.